Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. I heard a news story this weekend of how the police were called to a domestic dispute. And they talked to the neighbors, and they said there's this kind of escalating, really violent language in the apartment next door. So they went to the apartment next door, and what they found was it was just one guy who was having an argument with his parrot. Something zen about that. So that kind of led to this story, which you may have heard, which will lead to the subject of our talk. A young man named John received a parrot as a gift. The problem was the parrot had a bad attitude and an even worse vocabulary. Every word out of the bird's mouth was rude, obnoxious, and laced with profanity. John tried and tried to change the bird's attitude by consistently saying only polite words, playing soft music, and anything else he could think of to clean up the bird's vocabulary, but to no avail. Finally, John was fed up and he yelled at the parrot. And the parrot yelled back. John shook the parrot, and the parrot got angrier and even more rude, and in desperation he threw up his hands, grabbed the bird and put him in the freezer. For a few minutes, the bird squawked and kicked and screamed. And then suddenly there was total quiet. Not a peep for over a minute. Fearing that he killed the parrot, John quickly opened the door to the freezer, and the parrot calmly stepped out onto John's outstretched arms and said, "I believe I may have offended you with my rude language. I am sincerely remorseful for my inappropriate transgressions, and I fully intend to do everything I can to correct my rude and unforgivable behavior." Well, John was stunned at the change in the bird's attitude. As he was about to ask the parrot what had made such a dramatic change in his behavior, the bird continued, "May I ask what the chicken did?" So I'd like to talk about change tonight, and specifically about transitions, how we relate to change. And it's really kind of a follow-up on last week's talk on sickness, old age, and death, which is really all about the real transitions. But there are four parts to what I'd like to share tonight. The first is about how change happens. It's a fact. And then to talk about what can happen when you can change your attitude about change. What can happen when you can remember your intention in the midst of change and transitions. And what can happen when you actively embrace the change and the transitions in your life. So it was Heraclitus, quite a few years ago, who said, "There's nothing permanent except for change." And we overlook that all the time because of our attachments. There's one Dharma teacher who was sharing how I believe it was his 6-year-old son was having his birthday party. And he had this cake, he was surrounded by friends, and they were all singing, and his son started to cry uncontrollably. And he actually took his son out of the room and said, "What's going on?" And his son said, it's going to be a whole year before I can have this again. And that's us, unvarnished. We want to hang on to the good stuff. We want to get rid of the bad stuff as quickly as we can. As I was doing some research for this talk, I came across this article in Forbes magazine. 5 ways to make change happen faster. And I instantly thought, how many people on their deathbeds would freak out when they read that article? There are the 4 magic words that can make a happy person sad and a sad person happy. This too shall pass. The disappointment we have when the good stuff falls away. And the belief that when we are really caught and stuck, it's permanent. So remembering change is instrumental to being a doorway to happiness. So I thought I'd lead just a short little reflection on change in the body. So if you like, you can close your eyes. We tend to think of our bodies as being static. But I'd like to guide you through a little body scan with a little reflection on just how much is changing in the body. So if you feel the tongue and relax the tongue, your taste buds are only 10 days old. If you feel the lungs, the movement of the breath, your lungs, the tissue in your lungs is only 2 or 3 weeks old. If you feel the air touching the skin, no more than 2 weeks old. If you feel the density, the heaviness of your bones, 10 years. If you can sense the belly, the intestines, the villi in the intestines, 1 to 2 days. Your nails, 6 to 10 months. The red blood cells, 4 months. Your eyebrows and eyelashes, around 6 weeks old. Just taking a few moments to sense this constant state of transition in the body, all happening by itself. And if you like, you can let the eyes open, or you can remain with them closed if you prefer. So change is always happening. It's a fact. The first characteristic of reality, impermanence. Everything born out of causes and conditions is changing. And then it's a question of how fast are things changing? And this becomes one of the very interesting elements in meditation practice. And sometimes it's described as noticings per second. How many moments of cognition per second can there be? And when you really drill down, when you really relax, and you can get concentrated, it becomes a very fascinating inquiry. How many milliseconds of cognition are there in 1 second? One instructor talked about aiming for 10 noticings per second. It just seemed impossible. I thought, how about 3? Could I do 3 noticings per second? But sometimes there can be an experience in deep, deep meditation where your life almost seems like it's flickering. And it's very much like when you see a movie. That movie's running at 20 frames per second. When you slow it down, you begin to see that 1 second of a movie is 24 separate still frames. So the more you deepen concentration and relax, the more you begin to see exactly how quickly everything is in constant state of change. And when we forget that, we get caught, we get stuck. And we resist anything that's changing. So exploring your relationship to change and the transitions in your life can be very, very helpful. I had dinner Saturday night after our day long here, which was a really fun day long. I had fun. And he told me the story in his life, one of the pivotal stories in his life. He was a senior executive in a big company in New York City. And he was also passionate about triathlons. And for about 20 years, he had been training passionately and was just at the level of international competition. He had actually flown out to Hawaii to scope out the Ironman course so that he could, figure out his strategy for the different parts and so forth. He gave notice because he wanted to dedicate himself to this dream of being like a full-time athlete. He was in Manhattan going out for a ride with a friend. His last ride, everything was packed up in his apartment. And just before he split off from his friend, the last words he said to his friend were, "I've never been so happy in my life as I am right now." Minutes later, he was not only hit by a car, he was run over by the car. As you can imagine, how devastated he was. He spent months and months basically in traction in his apartment. And he still has some PTSD. He hasn't been on a bike since then. This was many, many years ago. But he has gone on to become very active and very productive in his life. But as he was describing this experience, this horrific experience, drew him into a sense of passion around healing and around yoga and around meditation, and enriched his life immeasurably. And it becomes a very interesting thing when you reflect on the most challenging times in your life. Chances are you developed some new skills, some new resilience, some unexpected teachings and learnings and transformations through those horrific experiences. Joseph Campbell, whatever your fate is, whatever the hell happens, you say, "This is what I need." It may look like a wreck, but go at it as though it was an opportunity, a challenge. If you bring love to that moment, not discouragement, you will find strength. Any disaster you can survive is an improvement on your character, your stature, and your life. What a privilege. This is when the spontaneity of your own nature will have a chance to flow. Then, when looking back at your life, you will see that the moments which seem to be the great failures, followed by wreckage, were the incidents that shaped the life you have now. You'll see this is really true. Nothing can happen to you that is not positive, even though it looks and feels at the moment like a negative crisis. It is not. The crisis throws you back, and when you are required to exhibit strength, it comes. There's a book out there called Anti-Fragile. I didn't read it, but my wife told me about it. It's a hard book to read. I'm not sure she finished it. But the basic punchline is just what Joseph Campbell was saying. It's the challenges that grow you. I spent some time with a doctor who also had a PhD in psychoneuroimmunology, and he was really big into lifting weights and martial arts, and did a lot of competitions and so forth. And basically he was saying is, if you are not challenging yourself, particularly physically with the body, your brain assumes you are dying. When you are creating resistance and challenge, your brain assumes you have a purpose and you are here to live. So embracing those challenges can be enormously helpful. Saying yes to what arises. And so this becomes a very interesting thing to explore when you're going through a big life transition. I seem to spend a fair bit of time with people who are in some process of letting go of something and something arising. I'd say most of us are in a constant state of that. But as I thought about a big recent transition for me, as I've mentioned before, I spent 24 years of living in a spiritual community. I stumbled in for lunch and stayed. And while I wasn't completely content there, I really gave my life there and assumed that I would be associated with that community for the rest of my life. It was an incredible platform to serve and contribute. And I knew the organization really well. I served in lots of capacities. I was a spokesperson. I was the head of the organization for a number of years. And then it was clear that it was over, that it was time for me to kind of pass the baton and move on. Right about then, fortunately, I met Tara, and I moved down here about 10 years ago. I didn't know anyone, and no one knew me. There were 4 things before I moved down here, 4 things I said I would never do. I would never move somewhere where I didn't have a job lined up. I would never move to a metro area. I would never get married. And I would never, ever renovate a house. I'm 0 for 4. So when I first moved down here, I was talking to someone, and they said, "So where are you from? What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, well, have you heard of Kripalu Center?" And they said, "No." And I said, "Well, that place you've never heard of, it used to be somebody back there." And so when I moved down here, I was given a spiritual name in the ashram. My name was Sudhir, and was called Sudhir for 24 years. My family called me that. That was my name. So when I moved down here to D.C., it was a question of, do I keep the name or do I let it go? It was a big decision. And I decided to let it go because I didn't want to be introducing myself as someone special. I thought, I'm just going to start over fresh. And so there was a real deconstruction of my identity, of who I was in that community. My whole story just didn't seem to be relevant anymore. And I really embraced that. It reminded me of when I graduated from college. I was going to a party, and my best friend's father-in-law was at this party. I said, well, tell me about, who's going to be there. And he said, well, when you meet my father-in-law, count how many seconds until he tells you that he was chairman of this big corporation. I won't name the name. I thought, what? So I was chatting with him. And he said, so what's your major? I said, well, in English composition and a minor in English literature. He said, oh, that's good. I was chairman of and I don't want to be that guy. So with that deconstruction of who I was and who I used to be, what began to emerge was, what do I want? What's my deepest intention? And part of my deepest intention is to serve and to teach, offer, contribute what I can contribute that would support people in their life. So I made up a rule. I said for the next year, because I want to teach, but let's see what happens. I said, I'll teach anyone, anytime, anywhere, anything. Whatever the question is, the answer is yes. And that began to kind of emerge a new life. And here I am. So oftentimes, when you're in transition, when there is a falling away, a letting go, whether you chose it or whether you didn't choose it, clarifying your intention can really help to open up new possibilities. There's the Chinese character for a crisis, which is opportunity. When something falls away, something else can emerge. Remembering that is so helpful. So remembering your intention, very, very helpful. And back in the ashram where I lived for many years, I used to supervise fasting programs. And I loved leading these retreats. People come for a week. And, like all great traditions say, fast and pray. It's powerful stuff. So kind of supporting people through that process was very, very gratifying. So people would come and they'd be, resting and meditating and doing yoga and eating really good food. And I remember a number of times people would come and they would complain that they were getting all these aches and pains, that they got really bad breath for some reason. And it was a problem. I'd always have to remind them, that's why you came here. You're detoxing. Your body is throwing off what it is now strong enough to release. So reminding people that was part of my job. And it's a very important thing to remember when you engage into a transformational practice, such as yoga or meditation, that it's a detox process. It will help you to let go what is no longer needed. As you strengthen your system, it'll begin to throw off what's no longer needed, whether it be physical or mental or emotional. And so what's so important, this is something my teacher's teacher said that's so helpful. He said that most people stop practicing precisely because the practice is working. If you're finding yourself resistant, the practice is working. You will feel better. Your anger, your irritation, your depression, all of it becomes part of the practice. And as much as we all want to become more alive and more whole and grow, we dislike discomfort and we fear the unknown. And if you think about a time in your life when you were afraid of a change coming up, it's helpful to remember that we all feel that clench inside. So I'd like to share with you one of my favorite readings. It's relatively long, but it's killer. If you like, you can close your eyes. Might as well rest your eyes. It's a long reading. And you might reflect on all the different times you've gone through a change in your life, or one you might be in the midst of right now. Sometimes I feel that my life is a series of trapeze swings. I'm either hanging on to a trapeze bar, swinging along, or for a few moments in my life, I'm hurtling across space in between trapeze bars. Most of the time, I spend my life hanging on for dear life to my trapeze bar of the moment. It carries me along a certain steady rate of swing, and I have the feeling that I'm in control of my life. I know most of the right questions and even some of the right answers. But once in a while, as I'm merrily or not so merrily swinging along, I look ahead of me into the distance, and what do I see? I see another trapeze bar swinging toward me. It's empty, and I know, in that place in me that knows, that this new trapeze bar has my name on it. It's my next step, my growth, my aliveness going to get me. In my heart of hearts, I know that for me to grow, I must release my grip on the present well-known bar and move on to the new one. Every time it happens to me, I hope, no, I pray, that I won't have to grab the new one. But in my knowing place, I know that I must totally release my grasp on my old bar, and for some moment in time, I must hurtle across space before I can grab onto the new bar. Each time I am filled with terror. It doesn't matter that in all my previous hurdles across the void of unknowing, I've always made it. Each time I'm afraid I will miss, but I will be crushed on unseen rocks in the bottomless chasm between the bars. But I do it anyway. Perhaps this is the essence of what the mystics call the faith experience. No guarantees, no net, no insurance policy, but you do it anyway because somehow to keep hanging on to that old bar is no longer on the list of alternatives. And so for an eternity that can last a microsecond or 1,000 lifetimes, I soar across the dark void of the past is gone and the future is not yet here. It's called transition. I have come to believe that it is the only place where real change occurs. I mean, real change, not the pseudo change that only lasts until the next time my old buttons get punched. I have noticed that in our culture, this transition zone is looked upon as a no thing, a no place between places. Sure, the old trapeze bar was real, and the new one coming toward me, I hope that's real too. But the void in between, that's just a scary, confusing, disorienting nowhere that must be gotten through as fast and as unconsciously as possible. What a waste. I have a sneaking suspicion that the transition zone is the only real thing, and the bars are illusions we dream up to avoid the void, where the real change, the real growth occurs for us. Whether or not my hunch is true, it remains that the transition zones in our lives are incredibly rich places. They should be honored, even savored. Yes, with all the pain and fear and feelings of being out of control that can, but not necessarily accompany transitions, they are still the most alive, most growth-filled, passionate, and expansive moments in our lives. And so, transformation of fear may have nothing to do with making fear go away, but rather with giving ourselves permission to hang out in the transition between trapeze bars. Transforming our need to grab any new bar is allowing ourselves to dwell in the only place where change really happens. It can be terrifying. It can also be enlightening in the true sense of the word. Hurtling through the void, we just may learn how to fly. So remembering that rush to avoid the void, and that time when you have let go, you're actually flying. I love that. It's hard to change inside. This is a transformational practice to ruthlessly assess your life. What are you engaged in that is life-enhancing and wholesome? What are you engaged in that is life-depleting? Can you let that go? Can you open to the next quality of aliveness that is coming your way? I often find that for many people who are going through change, that it's not only tough internally, but it's very, very tough to be going through change in relationship with those around you, particularly in families. When you look at family systems theory, transformation in a family system is really, really tough because everyone's got you locked in. If you change, that means they have to change. In some family systems, they'd rather excommunicate you than actually address the change that they would need to go through. It's hard work. It's swimming upstream, as the Buddha said. So there's this awful prayer, which I've shared before. It comes from yoga. That says, Lord, burn what can be burned, drown what can be drowned, and cut what can be cut. For I want to know what it is that cannot be burned, cannot be drowned, and cannot be cut. When you engage into a practice with a sincere intention to know who you truly are, so much falls away. And for so many people who engage into a practice where they're really beginning to slow down and hold themselves with non-judging awareness, through that sensitizing process, there's a recognition of things you were doing that are no longer satisfying, that just begin to fall away. Things that were not attractive before that are now attractive and compelling. Old fears lose their grip. The old dreams just don't quite have what it takes. So to engage into a transformational practice requires having a clear intention, having some way to stay awake to what is changing, and to be around those who are embracing change as well. An invaluable, invaluable resource. Some of us are more naturally inclined to move toward change, and some of us are more actively inclined to protect what we have. There's some very, very interesting brain studies on those who are naturally more conservative in their politics and those who are naturally more progressive in their politics. They're actually doing brain scans and looking at kind of the difference between these different brains. And in many ways, it's sort of our relationship to fear and our relationship to possibility. I don't want to get too controversial about this, but there are some interesting things. Just to share a little bit with you, I found this stuff really interesting that I'm quoting here from an article. Persons with right-wing views had greater skin conductive response, indicating greater sympathetic nervous system response to threatening images than those with left-wing views in one study. So there's just more of a sensitivity to what could be perceived a threat. They have a stronger startle reflex as measured by eye blink strength in response to noise. A larger amygdala, which is more of the fear center in the brain. It's a fascinating thing if you want to check it out. But what it reminds me is that when you begin to practice, you are evolving your brain. particularly when you encounter a threatening transition in your life. There's a natural response of fear and of calcifying, of protecting. When you can stay present to it, remember your intention, it allows you to open and expand your capacity for sensitivity, your capacity for empathy, your capacity for remembering your purpose and having that actually shift your nervous system becomes available to you. It's like Robert Thurman, he once said that meditation is an evolutionary sport. I love that. There are a couple little tidbits I just thought I'd share. When you find yourself going through a transition, there are a couple things that can be very helpful. The first is to remember your intention. What is most important to you through this time of transition? And it can be a rediscovery of what's most important in your life, an opportunity to recreate yourself. Once in the ashram, there were a number of people who took renunciation vows, vows to be a monk. And I was talking with one of the brothers, and you're given a new name when you have when you take your renunciation vows, and then you move to another part of the building. So he was moving, and I said, "What's it like to move?" And he said, "It's so easy." He said, "I'm moving from Govinda's room to Gitanand's room." And I would pick up each thing and say, "Does this belong to Govinda or does this belong to Gitanand?" So it was very simple. And I've actually suggested to people when they're moving to actually practice that. So this new sense of who you are in your new life, does this belong to that person or does it belong to the person you're leaving behind? So remembering intention can be helpful. This weekend we explored inquiry, the power of the questions you can ask yourself. And one of the interesting questions that can be so helpful in reframing is to ask yourself, what's great about this? Or what could be great about this? And as an inquiry, if you hang out with that question long enough, you will start to get a sense of, as I'm letting go of this, what could be great about this? It'll begin to turn your attention toward more resourcefulness, more creativity. A great little poem from Masahide, a Japanese poet who was born in 1657. I love this one. Barns burnt down. Now I can see the moon. Great reframe. Another question you can ask yourself is just to remember that other people feel this too. Whenever you're going through a transition, that clench, the fear of the unknown, everyone goes through that. It can be a way to sort of open to embrace the process of transition and transformation. There's always the question of when you're up against something, do you change the externals or can you change the internals? It's been said that the only thing you have control over is how you're relating to it. And it often becomes a question for many people when they're coming to the end of something, the end of a job or the end of a relationship or the end of a project. There's a little bit of tightness there. There's a tendency we have when we come to the end of something to make someone wrong. Either we make ourselves wrong or we make the externals wrong. But when you know it's time for transition, when you know you've come to the end, it's a little metaphor just to share with you. This is from Ken Wilber. I have found this to be so helpful. So think of it as if you've been eating at a buffet table and you're full. It's time to get up and walk away. And when I love that, if I'm talking with someone who's about leaving a job, They're frustrated, it's no longer working. But when they think about it, they were so excited to find that job. It was so stimulating for a while. It was so gratifying. And then they got full. Time to step away. And it allows you to step away with gratitude. It can be another way to kind of reframe a transition. So I am running out of time. This could be a 10-part talk. Why don't we take a few moments just to close and to share some silence together. You might just take a few moments to reconnect with your breath, just to, again, make contact with the here and now and the senses. And you might sense in your relationship to change, is there a trapeze bar coming in your direction? Is there one that you're letting go of? And in any time of transition, to remember and ask yourself, what is most important? And what could be great about this transition? And can you imagine as you let go of one trapeze bar before you grab the next, that is your aliveness. You are actually flying. And you might take a moment, if you know of anyone in your life who's going through a transition right now, perhaps struggling or in fear, to take a few moments to wish them well, to offer them some quality of loving presence, some compassion or empathy. And you might let that broaden out to all those who are going through change in their lives right now. And then again, deepening your breath. And as you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you for your kind attention. A few announcements. Just a reminder, there is an awesome yoga session. Starts at 6:30 to 7:20, led by awesome teachers. There's a labyrinth walk coming up. You can check the newsletter, information there for you. Also, there's a family retreat this summer. That's also in the newsletter, if you know of anyone who might be interested in that. Really, really cool thing. Also, there is a spiritual friends group that has some openings for those who might be interested, and it is in Alexandria. Yes. Would you like to stand up and wave your arms so we can see you, Lisa? This is Lisa, who has been supporting this group for a long time. If you would like to join one of these groups, it's a really wonderful way to support your practice. You come together occasionally for some time to sit, and then there's a kind of a very safe, structured sharing where you just acknowledge about what's up in your practice. And it's really designed to support you in being more relational in your practice in a very cool, safe way. So, Lisa, you'll be here. You'll be hanging out here if there are any questions and so forth. And as always, thank you for your support for myself and the class and the church. And remember that transitions require fuel, and that's why they're cookies. So enjoy that as well. We've got a great teacher, Steve Zapala, is going to be here next year. Next week. I'm going to be off on retreat. And Steve is a very dedicated mindfulness practitioner. He is transitioned from a career in the military to completing his PhD in psychology, and has been through some very, very interesting life experiences. And I've asked him to talk a little bit about worry and trauma. So his talk is entitled, What Me Worry. He'll be here next week. I think you'll enjoy him. So have a great evening and enjoy your cookie.